Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program. I'm your host, Chris Angle. I'm the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Philosophical Equations of Economics. These books are free for viewing at www.philosophypublishing.com. With me is my co-host and colleague, Rick Samuelson, and the purpose of the Philosophical Angle is to examine the nature of concepts being used in current media. Well, this week we're going to discuss a prognostication that our colleague Rick Samuelson has noted, that he believes that the European is destined to break apart, and so we're going to try and discuss that and figure out why that is going to happen. So we're going to investigate the cause of the coming dissolution of the European Union, and there are indications that this is already occurring. In the Wall Street Journal of September 5th, front page article by a guy named Anton Trovanovsky on the voting in Germany in one particular state was decidedly against the ruling Angela Merkel Democratic Party. It said, "Populist advance in Germany jolts Europe." And the first 2 paragraphs go like this. Growing populist forces shook Europe's pillar of stability this week as an unprecedented defeat for Chancellor Merkel's conservatives in Germany signaled more political tumult across the continent. For the first time in post-war history, Ms. Merkel's Christian Democrats finished behind a populist challenger to their political right in a state election, riding a wave of discontent with her migration policy. The Alternative for Germany, a 3-year-old anti-immigrant party, beat the Chancellor's party in her home state, spurring her allies to debate Monday whether she should change course. Another indication was the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union recently. So what is the cause, or what are the causes for this dissolution? Here are some of the possible culprits that I might suggest. Globalization, socialism, fascism, political correctness, and a culture clash. Well, I believe that these are all related. Those of you who are for individualism, these previously mentioned ideas are all anathema, as the two cannot coexist. And why is that? If we can understand this question and answer it, then we'll have a clue as to why the European Union will dissolve. So let's start with the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it defines these terms in the following manner. Fascism, a way of organizing a society in which a government ruled by a dictator controls the lives of the people, and in which people are not allowed to disagree with the government. Second definition, a very harsh control or authority. Well, I'd like to add that typically a fascist country through the dictator pretty much also owns the means to the production of goods and services in essence. And if one owns the means of production, you can control the people and not allow the people to disagree. Okay, so onward to our second definition from Merriam-Webster. We're going to define socialism, and that is a way of organizing a society in which major industries are owned and controlled by the government rather than by individual people and companies. But I'd like to contend that there's probably a second definition common in today's media usage, in which that the private enterprise owns the means to production, but is just heavily taxed to the extent that this money is used for social purposes. And And I think that definition is really prevalent. Thirdly, we're going to define political correctness, and this is my definition, and it doesn't come out of Merriam-Webster. All within society are equal before the law, equal for opportunity, and equal in result. That is, all individuals are equal. So now we have to define globalization. Globalization is the political correctness at the country or national scale. That is, all countries are equal, and all its laws are equal with all other countries, economically and socially. So if we take a look at these definitions, we can see that political correctness begets globalization. In other words, globalization is a subset of political correctness. There is a national political correctness, which would be intranational, and there is globalization, which is international political correctness. Now, in order for the left to accomplish its goals of political correctness, which ultimately is the goal of political justice, there is the requirement to believe that the ends justifies the means, in that they must take from one and give to another, like Robin Hood. And in order for the left to accomplish this, they need to control the means to production, and that is socialism. In addition, it needs to ignore ethicalities. In other words, it can't be ethical when dealing with the constituents of society. It cannot brook human freedom. The reason for this is that if the ends of all production has to be the same for all, if that social justice is complete, and there is equality in opportunity and in results of one's efforts, then it has to take away from those who have more to give those who have less, or whoever produces less. In order to do this, they need the means and need to control the production of goods and services. In order to promote this, they need to have the understanding that the end justifies the means. This type of rationality is totally unethical. And so now we need to define ethics, because I've just used it. We need to know the essence and nature of all that is ethical. Well, ethics is the appropriate dispensation of respect. And as there is no respect in forcefully taking from one person to give to another, because when you use force to take something away from another, you obviously are not giving that person his due respect. And that said, there's an interesting conclusion here. From what we've seen in this conversation, we can see that the left naturally, in order to accomplish its social justice goals, must move to a totalitarian society. That is, it must move to a fascist, or at least to socialist policies, in order to accomplish its social justice. And that is why throughout history, almost all societies have been totalitarian and fascist. That is, except perhaps the American experiment, Athens, the Roman Republic, at least in the beginning of it, or other societies that were actually there was at least a representative democracy, where the left was not in total control. But for most of humanity, with the kings and queens in communism or wherever there was a totalitarian society, the essence of the left was put in place throughout history. So how does this all relate to the European Union falling apart? Well, as we already stated, globalization and socialization of Europe is well advanced, and therefore automatically there has been evolving a centralization of governmental power. We can see that individuals have a diminished amount of rights in Europe. With these left-leaning governments comes a decision to gravitate to social justice and equality for all in outcomes. Thus comes heavy taxation, which is a form of making everybody equal. The opposite feeling of this is an antithesis toward those who receive more for their sacrifice in producing goods and services. That is, there emerges an antithesis against those who strive harder and use their knowledge and information and efforts to produce more for themselves. In the leftist thought arena, there is a consideration that these entrepreneurial people are necessarily bad in their objective and in their internal makeup. Thus, when we see the left, when the left sees the inflow of immigrants who are basically poor and do not have much in their society, to their society, which has more, they will embrace these people. And thus they have done so with open arms. But in the case of these immigrants, they are culturally opposite to those people living in the West. They are very culturally different. So much so that I can say that the twain shall never meet. So we can now come to a conclusion that if we know the essence of the difference between the immigrants' Muslim societies and the societies of the West, we can come to our ultimate conclusion here today. The Islamic society believes that all rights remain with God, and that all is for Allah, and that dissemination of all rights come from God and is distributed. And this is according to the first to the Quran, and to the which is the recital of the words from the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, and then secondly from the Hadith, which are the oral traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. And as the Quran says in Surah 8, verse 39, religion should be only for Allah. And Western society believes that there is a set of natural rights that rest with the individual and are given to the individual by God at conception. Well, some liberals will believe at birth, but that's a different argument. These rights are the natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these are not inclusive in the Islamic society. And this brings forth a clash in cultures. As more and more Muslims pour into Western society, it will induce a degenerative process in the West. And this is now being exhibited in these early elections. And folks don't like it. Okay, to summarize, I've spoken enough. The politically thinking left believes that the other person is inherently bad, that he exploits others when dealing with them. In order to rectify the situation, he institutes his philosophy that the ends justifies the means. This is done by socialism and or fascism, depending on how you define it, by taking from one by taxation or another form of coercion and giving it to those who don't have as much. The next step is socialism, connecting with its nation neighbors, giving us globalization. Globalization giving us open borders and international laws. And with it, giving us cultural clashes. Then, lastly, the last phase, the individual nations deciding to exit from globalization. Okay, I've spoken enough. Let's hear from Rick on this matter. What do you think about the future of the European Union?
Well, it's extremely bleak. I see it from a politically tactical level. The upcoming months and years, what we're observing is that contrary to what all the experts at the investment banks are saying, all of the experts in the various European governments were saying, the UK economy is actually accelerating. The UK stock market has been appreciating. The UK currency is now appreciating. The remaining stock markets in Europe are declining. The euro is declining. And the economic data coming out of the European Union, ex-United Kingdom, gets worse and worse, just as of a couple days ago. And so all of these forecasts that the worst would befall leaving the European Union have been for naught, and they've proven to be opposite what the truth is. And what's interesting is that investment banks like Goldman Sachs, UBS, were cheerleaders for trying to keep the United Kingdom within the European Union just as much as the IMF or the German government or any of the European Union leaders. So this is not simply there's clearly a privileged class, international class, which spans both the government and the private sectors that have an agenda. And Goldman Sachs is part of it. Other investment banks are part of it. It's not simply the European Union government members. So that's point number one. The problem with that is other governments and other peoples are noticing. So, for example, let's consider Italy. Italy has suffered tremendously under the euro. They cannot adjust their deficits. In other words, when they had a currency of their own, what would happen in the past is that the lira would depreciate, right, and they become more competitive, and they could regain competitiveness on a kind of cyclical basis that way. Well, with the euro, that's impossible, and as a result, Italian exports have become less and less competitive over time. So much so that there's virtually no economic growth in Italy. And this scenario has been repeated in all of Southern Europe, basically. As a consequence, the unemployment around Southern Europe is catastrophic levels and has been for years now. And this is the fruit of the introduction of the euro and the regulatory environment imposed on top of all these economies by the European Union. You have unemployment that has remained static, even official unemployment, and that always undercounts real unemployment, has remained static since the financial crisis began. In France, it's hovering around 17% unemployment generally, and over 20%, more like 25% for youth. And so we have, with many of these countries outside of Germany and perhaps the Netherlands and a couple of others, this pattern of extremely high unemployment concentrated amongst the youth, where they face a more or less hopeless future. We got a taste of this when we had a French exchange student come last summer, the summer before, and an Italian exchange student come last summer. She has no job prospects. She's entering college now, but she doesn't expect to be able to get a job at all. And the French student wants to move to England in order to teach English. So this is the fruit of the European Union
and there's supposedly benevolent governance. And what I see happening in the near future is triggered by the introduction of the million Syrians and other refugees, an extremely fragile economic entity has completely been blown away, and the confidence in that entity is eroding day by day, week by week, month by month. And you will see this reflected in upcoming elections. Apparently, the Austrian vote is being recounted now, and it's quite likely the right-wing party leader will assume the leadership there. Italy has a vote coming up in the next few months, which is basically a referendum on whether it's going to reform its economy or not. And of course, they've been through this cycle many, many times. And if that vote fails, many editorialists are suggesting that the next target will be getting Italy out of the euro, because they know it's been such a burden on the economy. The Netherlands is already talking about exiting the European Union. And so as each country exits, the countries that provide or subsidize the weaker economies in Europe place a greater and greater burden on Germany. And therefore, you've got several forces at work here that are breaking the European Union apart. You've got resentment against Islamic immigrants in a situation where there are no jobs, nor will there be any jobs. You've got the example of the United Kingdom, contrary to all the experts' opinions, actually prospering after Brexit, not suffering. You've got the known fact that historically, when the euro did not exist, particularly the countries in Southern Europe functioned much better economically and had much higher employment. And all of this is not lost on the Europeans, the European voters. They're not stupid people. And so I think it's just a matter of time before the European Union comes apart or remains simply Germany with a few rump states, probably in Eastern Europe and some elsewhere. But effectively, it will be a German bloc.
So you mentioned as it unravels, you mentioned that the burden on Germany will increase. Why do you suppose that?
Well, because there are subsidies flowing back and forth, right? The wealthier countries end up paying more, and the poorer countries are subsidized. And
right.
It's who's got the money, and Germany has the money.
Okay, so the German economy is the strongest throughout all of Western Europe. And,
by far.
Okay.
By far.
And there evidently is political correctness going on between nations already, with Germany subsidizing others. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's just the structure of the way the European Union works. So the UK was one of the subsidizers. Spain is one of the subsidy receivers.
Well, maybe as Brexit happened because they were a subsidizer, maybe Germany will leave first because it is proportionately a giant subsidizer.
Well, that is not an impossible scenario. I think as long as Merkel is there, that is not a topic that will be discussed publicly, at least not within the government. But if she were to be voted out of office, who knows? Who knows?
Right. Okay.
And she should be voted out of office. Her behavior's been disgraceful. And there's one other element here, and that refers back to the whole sorry situation between Germany and Greece. If you recall, not too long ago, the Greeks were asking for debt relief, essentially. Obviously, they've mismanaged their economy. The government sector controls a lot of the employment. The benefits are through the moon. It's an unsustainable state. That said, a central part of the European Union Treaty is that treaty members should be given first preference when it comes to moving to other countries and taking jobs. Well, none of that happened, right? There's been some movement of Spaniards and Greeks to Germany, but not anything like the scale we see with these refugees being invited in and essentially given jobs. And so you have the spectacle of a country that is truly in need, namely Greece, and I'm talking about the people of Greece now, I'm not talking about the government, where the screws were put to them by the Germans, who very publicly criticized Greece, and yet when it comes to dealing with Muslim refugees, no burden is too great. We will happily spend 2 or 3 billion euros just to teach these refugees German. Well, I mean, can you imagine that this is lost on the Greeks? They're not stupid people either.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much, and I hope everybody's enjoyed this episode of The Philosophical Angle, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.
Thank you.